Hello everyone, today we observe the libraries and military curricula of some of the most important generals in the French reigns of Henry IV and Louis XIII. Some of you just recently asked me, why don't you make a video about the French army at the time of the cardinals? We will, of course, do that also in function, of course, to the 30 Years' War, but also and especially like the reign of Louis XIV, what was France before that, right? In part, this can be really useful because it's actually a reflection grafted on, let's say, that criticism that I expressed toward especially Max Jens and Werner Halbweg's works that, as you know, tended to magnify essentially the vastity of printed knowledge of the, say, size of libraries devoted to the subject of war among the, in general, but especially connecting it positively and allegedly as such to the direct application of such insights on the art of war by the constables of the time, right? And I made already multiple videos, especially criticizing a bit like what is. However, the very successful, that as a historical datum is very interesting and very important politically and morally of the Protestant and also, in a sense, more narrowly Dutch propaganda during the 80 Years' War regarding the reforms of the Nassaus pertaining to the military, the alleged influence of the classical military treatises in defining Renaissance warfare. And again, I already spent myself on that topic. I'm not going to digress on it now, right? But every once in a while I get questions like, but why do you think so? Like, actually, there is something to it. We know that, I don't know, experienced men of war read these things. Yeah, okay, but that's not like picking individual cases. This is about understanding in diachronic and comparative perspective essentially what it means to theorize the art of war from the 16th to the 18th century. And if you have studied von Clausewitz, it actually dedicates himself also in the Von Kriege a lot to that regarding, in fact, the positive applicability of military theory for the sake properly of command, right, by the officers, those who are going to lead the armies in campaign on the battlefield. You don't have anything even resembling say a positive description of warfare that could be of auxiliary use. Obviously, could never even come minimally close to substitute direct military experience. In fact, until von Clausewitz himself, actually, until the 18th century, that's when they began essentially to observe that if we reason on a broader military theory, there should be some sort of scientific and moral foundation to that. It's not really until von Clausewitz and never after him that such sort of peak was reached. I would like to add that you must study the art of war historically as well. Von Clausewitz was a hell of a military historian, not just a field general and a broader theorist, but someone who studied history very accurately and also like proving wrong all those sad culturalists that still to this day proving that they haven't studied the Von Kriege, by the way, nor actually studied military history in an equally diachronic and comparative way, still think that von Clausewitz was describing 19th century Napoleonic warfare, right? And that none of his perspective, of course, on the rest of warfare as, is valid because somebody arbitrarily, subjectively decided, not having even opened the Von Kriege, that tells something very different and gives you the very obvious evidence of why that is the case, have come up with, right? And equally, there is this effort, and I know some of these scholars actually write for journals that are run by people, by other scholars that are very much, even positively, naively, I would say, in this idea that essentially a 16th century, early 17th century manual had anything to do with the actual art of war that was cultivated on the very sort of active European battlefields at this time, and that just simple browsing of the actual content of these works can reveal you in their ideal. And sort of, there's no doubt it was an intelligent exercise. It was something, of course, connected to the practicality of warfare, etc. But you should know, just from the broader history of Western civilization, like the philosophical foundations of what could actually come close to be a description of warfare and how to handle it, just at the end of the day for an auxiliary function. And the same people, but even up to the 18th century, of course, like mostly connect anecdotes rather than even sort of developing, especially at this time, sort of broader theories about the art of war, which probably weren't there as a genre. That's not what they talk about. It would actually do the opposite of what they wrote. And so it's not a deficit. This is not about saying, these people then were writing things for nothing, or because, I don't know, they were dumb or they were abstract. No, the problem is modern people, today's people, are stupid in assuming that the reason why they wrote it had anything concretely to do with how warfare was actually waged. I mean, something is just a simple, I don't know, illustration of how a musketeer reloads his weapon is one thing. You can actually teach soldiers how to do that on the field in this kind of manuals, right? But on the bigger scale of things, how an army functions and deploys and operates on campaign, etc., is something that, from even if you read, for example, the first person who really started agglutinating this concept together from the Iron Century in the 17th century, this Montecuccoli, is really the milestone in military theory between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz. You realize that, of course, these are sort of relative principles, right? It's like people who still search for Sun Tzu's principles, thinking that they're actually an absolute foundation of the art of war. These people are just illiterate, uneducated in the most elementary, philosophy or science of Western history throughout the millennia, not to see that that's just a collection of anecdotes. It even tells you things as far as never besiege cities, or, I mean, it was obviously, to contextualize in our reality, it was not even remotely close to think to write something of that kind. Why? Because those people were actually fighting war a lot, successfully, intelligently. And even just the exercise of trying to transmute this, to transfer this into some sort of written theory, was against even great part of their actual culture, right? How can you be at the same time a constable and, I don't know, a great scientist of the art of war, right? The reason why von Clausewitz comes to be that fundamentally is also that he had not just an excruciating military experience, but that he lived in the same and in the wake also, culturally speaking, of the works of Kant and Hegel, right? Somebody from the time of Pythagoras, but even also from Shakespeare, definitely could not or would not be able to write something like that, right? So it's that simple of a concept that you can really mirror at every step of the way, whichever sort of political, military, social indicator you can appreciate about Europe as a whole, right? And again, I talked a lot about this because starting from the sort of Protestant myth about the particular advancement, for example, of the Dutch military during the 80 Years' War, it's not because an army wins, and even so that well and successfully, and the Netherlands must be praised, like in the history of Western civilization, for what they did at the time, that this has actually anything to do with some sort of super sophistication or wisdom about, I don't know, which principle of the art of war. That was, in fact, never, just by studying the battles, and could have never, actually, in that specific strategical context, even been fledged out, had it even been ever conceived. But there was an enormous propaganda that was incredibly important for the Protestant cause of the time in promoting the Dutch school and its military academy and the general alliance with especially the German Protestants, in that sort of sense, we have our own way of war. There is something inherently special or specific about us, except whatever development was occurring. For example, even in the Swedish armies of Gustavus Adolphus, that was a hell of a commander and surely brought to a great innovation in the Swedish army, even though not even here in the anecdotal mythology that would see like a uniformity in these innovations in the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus that wouldn't actually be applied until even the time of Charles XII. Some sort of again, something that the Catholics didn't have. If you study actually what the Spanish were not just fighting like, but even writing, you realize that in many ways that was actually even more advanced. And that there is all like an incredibly successful result of that propaganda still today, that however must be tested with what was happening on the field, right? And I'm a medievalist. I don't specialize in early modern warfare, so I can't say to have the greatest competence on the globe to analyze every single source or battle and knowing how the entire early modern warfare worked like. I'm doing my little, as far as this is concerned. You realize that I'm talking more about Renaissance warfare in general, and surely with my sort of military historical background, I can't guide people through the issue, the theme, the topic in general. However, it doesn't really take that to understand why this is a thing, in fact, but why, nor like the validity of these precepts, not the actual applicability of the same, is to be even assumed that some precepts were so foundational, revolutionary, or even innovative compared to what would to the reality of warfare in what was even written. You would be surprised how that even wasn't, right? How it wasn't even the intention of the authors, because this is a completely contemporary modern mindset. People didn't reason in terms of revolutions or modernity or God knows what on this kind of fireworks and emotional phraseology and vocabulary. But we are here for this too, and so we can observe here very empirically, as a matter of fact, into speaking of empirical knowledge, in fact, of how, for example, some of the greatest French commanders of the period of the French Wars of Religion, but especially like at the end of that, and also the reign of Louis XIII, and we will surely look at their history in some other video here and there for sure, wouldn't actually have a great deal of military historical treatises. These were, again, some of the greatest commanders that France could field at the time, and even those who had, of course, they would have libraries, but even those that were consistent didn't actually, and we can section in this regard, didn't really have great focus on military treatises at all, right? And I think that's actually an incredibly useful, let's say, indicator that shows you how actually, in order to be the good commanders, these people were, even topics like ecclesiology were actually considered more important than these military treatises. And here we're talking both Catholics and Protestants, because as we've seen in the recent videos about the French Wars of Religion, of course, there were plenty of Huguenots that had some sort of experience, connection with what was happening in the Netherlands, and they were promoting themselves, those ideas, and coming back from sometimes a literal service in there against the Spanish, surely infatuated with the idea of a Protestant reform, not just in a confessional sense, but in a truly military one, in the wake of this great Dutch spirit that was sort of molding the idea about this. Naturally, we don't have here to confuse, by the way, treatises authors with commanders necessarily. It could overlap, but notoriously wasn't quite the same thing. And again, prior to this video, you should also understand more or less what were the actual literary genres of the time, to understand more or less what, for example, even military historical knowledge really was, how they studied military history, which is definitely not how we started doing, say, in a really effective way since the 19th century, mostly in a historiographical sense. They didn't have that at the time. And of course, how the broader mythology of the Renaissance intertwines with these ideas. We've seen it in the videos about the influence of classical works, Aelianus, especially for the Dutch, but there are, let's say, this imitation, not just of the Romans, but of the Carthaginians, even because of the rediscovery of the classics, of the philological perfectioning of the historical analysis. These are all important things. It's not like the Renaissance didn't bring, that would be criminal to say, that actually a great step further in the understanding of these ideas. And surely these commanders were fascinated with, of course, learning of, for example, the exploit of the ancients. But we should always understand this intellectual interest, this inspiration, this even the assumption of a model, right, for political, propagandistic reasons, in fact, is not, by definition, the positive direct transposition of military principles into the reality of warfare. That was also very different, by the way, from the one of ancient times, needless to say. And that is something that, if you know, like the querelle between von Clausewitz and Jomini, we'll make videos about Jomini. Some of you asked me, like, gets down to principle of internal lines that the Prussians won of moral forces destroyed. And Jomini was a hell of a man, also and especially in admitting, after his enormous fortune, following his own ideas, that actually the ones of von Clausewitz were correct in the end. But this is also something for another video. As we were saying before, there is actually not like a widespread evidence that the studies of military literature present us like this idea of a vast library devoted to the subject of war, say between the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century. In reality, we actually know very little about even the extent to which unit commanders engaged in these texts. As a historian, that's the least I can tell you. Like, everything is founded on the actual evidence, right? Unfortunately, there is a method of making history, is a very lazy one, that still is somehow in vogue, and I suspect for very specific methodological reasons, and partly heuristic ones, of course, that call for that because make it simpler. Modernists, I have an incredibly bad relation with modernists, not even with contemporaries, because contemporaries to me are like, it's just like holding a child by his hand and leading him to the world. Like they're not there. They don't have the malice to actually denigrate medieval history and pretending hopelessly to invent that there ever was something like a modern era that was recognized as such, that you can fundamentally just define without realizing that it was the Middle Ages continuing all along until 1792 or 1918, depending on the places, right? And the lazy approach that they all often use, because I can tell you, as someone specializing in early 14th century history, it's extremely hard already at that time for that time to know, like even in a regional context, like all the sources available. It's practically impossible. You can imagine someone studying the 16th or the 17th century must forcefully, you also have to understand that just a selection of works that by definition is incomplete, does not show the entire picture, and that becomes the foundation of a study, and it allows you to point out things, but it cannot speak for the entire picture. Technically, it depends. Were I to conduct, a doctorate, another one on this, I thought about it, telling the truth, especially because if I hadn't studied ancient or medieval history, I would have definitely studied early modern warfare. There's no doubt about this. So I'm actually very interested in this topic myself. But the idea being, of course, that it's not by picking, say, even just 10 treatises that you understand, first of all, how many others there were there if you haven't studied them say strongly, and you don't have an idea of how and where they circulated. If you haven't done all that work and properly the historical research to understand even how do you understand whether somebody bought a book just for showing off or just for reading it. I have a collection of, at this point, over 15,000 books. Does it mean that I know them all? No, they must be indicative of my interests. Yes, they're all about military history. But do I know them? You will never know. Like, there would never be a person, 200 years from now that says, oh my god, Schwerpunkt truly read this book because here I found, in the video a reference to that. There's no way to understand the complexity of somebody's thoughts and simply saying, okay, well, that's how important it was for them. And needless to say, it's not like these guys were exchanging letters like schoolgirls and said, oh, you read that book, it's so interesting. No, right? We don't have something like that, right? We know, on the other hand, because we barely know their military history at the time, and we know better, however, the latter than this kind of thing. And of course, the warfare at the time is, as far as I understand, has not been studied adequately. As far as I understand, there have been great works, some path-opening ones, but as far as I know, because this is not being done for medieval warfare as well, that is very difficult to do, but sort of tremendously easier considering the amount of sources. There's not such thing like a diachronic comparative study. Yes, I will repeat these two adjectives because they are very precise for what I mean. For the study of early modern warfare. This is incredibly complicated, right? You can have a very good sort of military culture about the era. You can know what were the main commanders, the secondary ones, the broader military history of the West at the time. But still, it's not like you will have studied every battle and compared it to the others and realize necessarily how warfare was waged. Modernists tend, again, obviously, to make this kind of approximations because to an extent it's not like we can know much better, and nor a single person often can, right? So what we see, and so you have to understand that here I'm making an effort to be as accurate and objective as possible, even with the relatively short time I have on Schwerpunkt. Like books on tactics and military history from the 16th and the 17th century could either be, say, voluminous written works aimed at celebrating an army. That's very much of a thing. And that was done, for example, for the Dutch one, or given their often rich and distinctive iconographic features, items pursued by book collectors, scholars, and in short, the shelves of those who were actually not experts in the field. This aspect is often overlooked, right? Even though the printing press was there, better properly the press, the actual value of books was still fundamentally high, and especially for this massive sort of more pompous treatises that were trying to make some sort of higher claim. It's not like the majority of people really were would read the stuff or would even be able to read, nor, let's say, you can interpret these works outside that sort of celebrative, political, and sort of cultural milieu that very often was not even connected properly to the world of Mars, right, of the men at the arms. And in many ways, these are beautiful works also in a codicological sense. They're very expensive, they're very beautifully illustrated. In fact, I actually love to make videos about the early modern era because there is lots of pictures and they're all public, they're all copyright free, almost all. And I have to make less of a list at the end of the video, but they really show, like, also in sort of very stylish and to an extent accurate fashion, of course, what some aspects of warfare really looked like, right? Military historians of this that studied this period often have to literally study paintings, right? What did an army look like really out there. As we know, especially for 18th century linear tactics, there are somehow more, say, being especially also European warfare, ever more homogeneous, like really can't show you like some geometrical patterns and problems, because we do not know fully even just like the distances, the speeds, the how a battle was overall fought. Never think that we actually know that clearly. I write articles on medieval battles of which we have so few information, which actually, as a matter of fact, it's more of a problem sometimes, but even there, you have no idea how much comes out if you sort of get into them and start reasoning, looking at the battlefield, calculating sizes of the formations, following the accounts closely. It's not that 16th and 17th centuries battles are that enormously more or better described, right? And so, in many ways, we are a bit, sources are a bit mute regarding at least some aspects that we would have liked to know more, especially from a strictly technical point of view. And even the fact alone that this information is not provided actually tells you how somehow irrelevant it really was in this sort of descriptive or even positively, applicative concept of the art of war could really be. In other words, they didn't even care about that. Fortunately, however, we have, going back to the constables' libraries and their empirical knowledge, well-documented accounts belonging to specific commanders, some also the best, some of the most representative or frequently cited of the historical period. And today we will talk a bit about them to show you, from one side, what their military curriculum really was, but also how actually scarce, the reference properly to military, the actual presence of military treatises was in their libraries. A very interesting figure is François de Bonne, the constable of Lesdiguières. Today we talk about the French, and so also a country that had, as you know, like it was very advanced, also literary-wise and in culture, so that we are not poorly documented on compared to more like Central Europe, for example. It was really a more feudal, archaic place, for example. Even the Dutch were emerging from some sort of new background, for example. That matters. Like they would write in ways that would have been different, for example, from the French. They were a much more sort of, in this case, feudal aristocratic, but also more standardized and developed society. All right. This latter aspect is very interesting as well, because the French had a hell of a military culture, right? If you look at that video I made last year on the Battle of Freiburg of 1644, you realize way before the Sun King reformed, like what kind of a hell of military culture existed in the French army. Just looking at the resistance, the drive, the losses that their infantry could take at the time. These were armies led by aristocrats that still fought on horseback and had an incredibly high sense of themselves rather than, say, the commoners, etc. So France has really very interesting paradigm to scope. Now, the aforementioned François de Bonne, the Duke of Lesdiguières, stands out in the annals of French military history, particularly for his strategic and tactical maneuvers during the tumultuous period of the French Wars of Religion. He was born as early as 1543. Lesdiguières quickly demonstrated his martial talents, first serving under the local leadership in the Dauphiné. However, his pivotal moment came when he aligned with the Huguenots, right, leading to a series of bold military actions that established him as the formidable commander that we remember. His adept handling of troops during mountain warfare in the Dauphiné especially won him acclaim, and he distinguished himself in significant battles like the ones of Jarnac and Moncontour. In 1577, he emerges as a prominent leader of the Huguenot resistance in this era that, as you know, had and would keep having problems with the Protestants, the Waldensians. I made a video about the in fact, the French intervention in Piedmont during the time of the Augustan League, of how the local Protestants sort of resisted that. And Lesdiguières seized the strategic town of Gap through a daring night assault, fortifying it to strengthen the Protestant cause, a reflection of his tactical acumen. And though he later had to relinquish Gap under the Treaty of Poitiers, he did not capitulate without first securing better terms for his province through persistent warfare. These are the years in which the French wars of religion are raging. Southern France was very much like the place where most Protestants concentrated. As the years progressed, Lesdiguières' strategic orientation shifted to support the now Catholic Henry of Bourbon, had become King of France in exchange, in fact, of his confessional switch, ruling as Henry IV. Capturing for him key locations and consolidating control over the Dauphiné, a feat that underscored Lesdiguières' ability to adapt and thrive under changing pressures. Lesdiguières displayed remarkable success against the Savoyard forces in this front, notably defeating them at the Battle of Esperon and pressing on into Italy to reclaim Saluzzo, which highlighted his capacity for an aggressive yet calculated military approach. His construction of defensive structures in Grenoble and other locales, such as the Bastille, further illustrated his commitment to fortifying the Huguenot positions and securing territorial gains. Fortifying French positions and securing territorial gains. Despite his profound military contributions and a lengthy career marked by success, tensions arose with Henry IV, who regarded Lesdiguières' acquired power in Dauphiné legitimately with suspicion. Nevertheless, Lesdiguières was honored with the title of Marshal of France and continued to serve loyally, after all, throughout the monarchy's transitions. His later years saw him navigate the complexities of loyalty and political pragmatism, particularly after his own conversion from Protestantism in 1622. Naturally, the wars of religion, there were still many Protestants in France, as you know, but especially if you are of a certain status, you must just look at the king, make some concessions. It's interesting, by the way, that he literally was born and raised in that France that was just beginning to be acquainted with the Calvinist ideas. So he would have had like a deep history, spiritually speaking, regarding these issues. But again, he was a pragmatic guy, and this, in fact, put a just standing among former allies as well. Lesdiguières led royal forces against both Huguenots and foreign adversaries at this point, playing a crucial role in finding a negotiated resolution during, by the way, the siege of Montpellier in the Midi. Although he faced challenges, especially in his final campaign in the Valtellina, where his effectiveness waned, his overall record was one of consistent tactical success and strategic brilliance across 6 decades of conflict. I mean, this was really a hound of war. His legacy as a military leader is underscored by his cunning, adaptability, and significant wartime accomplishments during such crucial period in French history. We have the fortune of having his collection of books being housed in his palace in Grenoble, that, as we've seen, he contributed to fortify, and this collection is gathered and entrusted at the time to Lesdiguières' friend, Geoffrey de Calignon. So it was a great care, considered what we were saying before, that having a library wasn't still at this point in history like such, an influent and irrelevant deal, right? These were very costly treasures. You understand the nobiliar caliber of these individuals, and so the splendor of their houses had to be reflected, of course, in the intellectual exploit. We're just a matter of status in many ways. I mean, Francis I went almost bankrupt for his splendidly adorned, uniformed, enriched cottages, talking about the Roman antiquities, and so we're talking here about also a matter of competition between the same noble. And what is interesting about Lesdiguières library, the content of which we will see in a while, is that it is actually an exception, however, among the ones, let's say the general libraries of those commanders serving in the same Lesdiguières time, the King of France. Right, actually compared to them, like Lesdiguières had a considerable accumulation of printed texts and manuscripts, even because consider that medieval manuscripts were still there, and they were also very precious still already at the time, like they had been since ever, right? So this makes a Lesdiguières library bit of a rarity. What other figures do we have actually that we can compare? People that didn't actually have as a relatively modest library in comparison to, especially not much to Lesdiguières in this case, for example, but also to their own means, meaning that they were very powerful people. They could have spent more buying more than, for example, 100 volumes. Well, they didn't. They wouldn't spend that much. They really didn't have that much amount. And, so surprise, not surprise, actually, most of the books that they possessed were primarily concerning, according to you, what? Of course, religion. And, as good Renaissance men, classical history. Right, so not military treatises. We're talking, and we'll give here a curriculum to each of these figures, but famous and sort of respected commanders. For example, the Marshal of Schomberg. It would have been Schomberg, but that is Schomberg actually, because they had naturalized French. Here we're talking specifically about Henry de Schomberg, the Comte de Nantua, a notable, and yet another Marshal of France during the reign of Louis XIII, recognized for both his strategic victories and his leadership in military campaigns. Born in Paris, he initially served as the superintendent of finances. This was very relevant considering how money is really the sinews of war. I made a video about financing war, actually, in early modern Europe. He covered this office from 1619 to 1623, before, in fact, being appointed to the Marshalship of France in 1625. We're talking the years of the 30 Years' War, right? I have more incoming, by the way, about that. And one of Schomberg's significant tactical accomplishments occurred in 1628, when he led an army of 6,000 men to rescue Toiras during the siege of Saint-Martin-de-Ré. We are in Aquitaine. Essentially here Charles I had sent the Duke of Buckingham to cause further havoc in France. This had been also places of further previous Huguenot, say, communities, etc. And following this victory, Schomberg effectively pursues the retreating English forces led by the very Duke of Buckingham, inflicting considerable losses on them. Schomberg also took command of royal troops in various confrontations against, in fact, the Huguenot rebellions, including the siege of Privas, showcasing his military leadership during a turbulent period. Schomberg's strategic prowess culminates in a notable victory, won on September the 1st, 1632, when he defeated Henry II de Montmorency at the Battle of Castelnaudary. Sadly, Schomberg's career and life were cut short briefly after this victory, as he died of apoplexy on November the 17th, 1632, in Bordeaux. Another great figure is the Constable of Luynes. That is actually Charles d'Albert, that is the first Duke of Luynes, in fact, really a pivotal figure in early 17th century France, recognized both for his connections at court and his strategic actions under King Louis XIII. As a favorite of the king, Luynes was appointed with this title, as well as the one of Constable of France. Yet his influence was marred by both accomplishments and failures in military and courtly affairs. Luynes played a central role in court intrigues, using his influence to eliminate the Queen Mother, Marie de' Medici, his favorite, that was Concini, in 1617. This assassination underscored his tactical maneuver within the political landscape. He further solidified his power by negotiating the Treaty of Angoulême in 1619, which granted the Queen Mother significant liberties and demonstrated his ability to moving in this landscape. And despite his political achievements, Luynes faced criticism for his military capabilities. In 1621, he reluctantly led an expedition against Protestant forces in southwestern France, reflecting his long-standing opposition to such campaigns. His appointment as constable was controversial as a consequence, as it was partly due to the refusal of the more qualified Duke of Lesdiguières to renounce his Protestant faith. It's important because here, prosopographically, these people know each other, right? So they sort of frequent the same environments, same milieu, that the same manuscripts circulate, right? But this curricula are meant to highlight how these people were involved in warfare to that great degree. Luynes participated, for example, in the failed siege of Montauban, where from August to November 1621, for which he was criticized despite not being the field commander. Here there are more political than military issues, or say proofs of his capacities. But definitely he was sort of accused of lacking military prowess of sort. The other figure is the Duke of Candale, Bernard de Nogaret de la Valette, 1592-1661. He was a notable French general and Duke of Épernon, recognized for his strategic military contributions as well as significant tactical missteps throughout his career. After a promising start in military service, which included roles like Colonel General of Infantry and participation in key sieges, such as those of Saint-Jean d'Angely in 1621 and Royan in 1622, he faced several pivotal challenges. In 1635, under King Louis XIII, Bernard was tasked with restoring order during a period of civil unrest, fighting in Picardy and Guyenne, and successfully quelling the Revolte de Croquant in 1637. However, his most notable tactical failure occurs in 1638, when he was charged by the Prince de Condé to lead an assault at the siege of Fuenterrabia. He wisely declined due to concerns over the adequacy of the breach, yielding command to Vice Admiral de Sourdis, whose ill-fated attack resulted in disastrous losses. This debacle was wrongfully blamed on Bernard, leading to a near-fatal court ruling against him, compelling him to flee to England even. Despite this setback, Bernard's fortunes improved after his father's death in 1642, when he ascended to the title of Duke of Épernon. Upon returning to France, after Louis VII's death, he was exonerated by the Parlement of Paris in 1643. Later, as governor of Guyenne, he effectively executed logistical operations, transporting artillery to restore stability amid unrest in Bordeaux. Bernard continued to hold military and administrative positions, including governorship of Burgundy between 1654 and 1660, reaffirming his strategic importance in the French military, despite earlier tactical failures that, as we've seen, had not been entirely properly due to his own incapacity. Now, as we've seen, these are people who were heavily involved in military career. The Créquy-Lesdiguières that, as we've seen, had sort of the largest library, but that, as we have, you can understand, he wouldn't actually care too much about military treatises. That's the point of this video. We actually have other, actually very important figures. One was the Monsieur Gaston d'Orléans, that is the brother of the same Louis XIII, and Bassompierre. We'll see now these figures military-wise that we mentioned separately from the others because they actually displayed very limited interest in books. Gaston, the Duke of Orléans, was involved in several strategic and tactical accomplishments as well as failures during his lifetime, primarily shaped by his political ambitions and conflicts with his brother Louis XIII, as well as Cardinal Richelieu. Initially, Gaston held nominal command of the army during the siege of La Rochelle in 1628, the famous one enacted by Richelieu against the greatest Huguenot stronghold, indicating a military leadership role despite his later political intrigues. The Orléans political ambitions led him to engage in conspiracy, in fact, against his brother and Richelieu. Notably, he waged an unsuccessful war in Languedoc, leading to the Battle of, we mentioned before, Castelnaudary, 1632, which culminated in his flight to Flanders. After a failed assassination attempt against Richelieu in 1642 alongside the Marquis de Cinq-Mars, Gaston managed to escape responsibility for it by abandoning his accomplice. After Louis XIII's death, Gaston took on the role of lieutenant general of the kingdom and pivoted to warfare against Spain on France's northern frontiers. This period marked a more assertive military involvement, although the outcomes of his campaigns are less well documented. During the tumultuous periods of the Fronde between 1648 and 1653, Gaston displayed a lack of loyalty to the crown, switching allegiances. He is actually the father of Mademoiselle, that was Louis XIV's cousin, who attempted to, in fact, to deprive him with the throne. She actually used cannons in Paris during the revolt, which gives you an idea also what was the general ambition of these people. Gaston's political maneuvering during this time ultimately led to his exile by Cardinal Mazzarino in 1652, ending his active participation in court politics and military endeavors. As far as Bassompierre is concerned, instead we're talking about François de Bassompierre, 1579-1646, essentially a French courtier who made notable strategic and tactical contributions during his military career, while experiencing failures instead in his diplomatic endeavors. Bassompierre's military accomplishments began with his participation in a brief campaign in Savoy in 1600, and his involvement in the Hungarian campaign against the Ottomans in 1603. In 1614, he supported Marie de Medici in her struggle against the nobility, but after her defeat in 1617, he shifted loyalty to King Louis XIII, playing a significant role in the royalists' victory over Marie's supporters at Le Pont de Sey in 1620. His effective service during the Huguenot uprising from 1621 to 1622 earned him the title of Marshal of France. He participated in the 1628 siege of La Rochelle and distinguished himself the year later during the campaign against Huguenot rebels in Languedoc, particularly at the siege of Privas. Furthermore, in the same year, he leveraged his position as Colonel General of the Swiss and Grisons to raise troops for Louis XIII's campaign against Savoy. Conversely, Bassompierre's career as a diplomat was fraught with failures, as we remembered. His mission to Madrid in 1621 aimed to resolve the dispute over the Valtellina forts, culminating in the ineffectual Treaty of Madrid. This was important because, as you know, the Valtellina was along the Spanish road, so the previous French involvements in there threatened the connections of Spain with Germany, especially during the 30 Years' War and part of the 80-year one, and so with the Habsburgic Netherlands. Similar setbacks occurred during Bassompierre's 1625 and 1626 missions to Switzerland and London, respectively. These diplomatic challenges overshadow his military successes, but he's definitely a figure that is worth being remembered. So you understand what's the background here, like the military careers, the involvement, the connection with the crown, the fact that really this is a very elite society, and the aforementioned interest in warfare is something that even people were not necessarily cut for it, how to invest themselves in. So you may think, I don't know, maybe these people read military treatises. Well, this is something that really a contemporary person uses to think. As we've seen, Lesdiguières, that is by far the most impressive of these commanders, does have the largest library of all. Actually, one of the most impressive ones in the whole Kingdom of France. And we have, fortunately, documented the entirety of this library thanks to an inventory dating to 1677, so this is far after Lesdiguières' death, providing that you see also as a library had remained intact as some sort of treasure, right? And we don't know fully what kind of relation Lesdiguières had with these works intellectually, but curiosity, like for whichever scientific purpose. Naturally, they would read them, one may think, but for which purpose, with which mind, with which greater positive goal, right? From this inventory, we have 774 titles. Remember, hardly any other library of these commanders surpasses 100. And we are already in modern times where libraries, at least for them, would have been more easily filled than, say, in the Middle Ages. So these 774 titles are actually part of the main core of the Créquy-Lesdiguières collection, to which a manuscript collection sold in 1716 was later added. This is an interesting aspect because there's the story behind it. Also, the preservation and transportation of this library is fascinating. The Créquy-Lesdiguières one was moved by François-Emmanuel de Créquy, that was the great-grandson of our Lesdiguières, and brought to the castle of Sceaux in Languedoc, because this is where François-Emmanuel usually resided at that point. So he wanted, again, we're very different times, to read, to have this books there. And in 1711, the Villeroy family inherits the castle of Sceaux because, as well as the Lesdiguières Palace in Grenoble, because the extinction of the family, and as a consequence, they reunited the library, and that's what they eventually put it put it up for sale in 1760. And because the family was in dire economical straits, which also tells you how still at the beginning of the 18th century, like this magnificent Renaissance libraries were really worth a fortune. Some of the books and manuscripts, right, because there are medieval titles as well, were auctioned in Toulouse and purchased by the abbot of Marmoutier, that was interested in this antiquary pieces. And after 1792, you know what happened there, the Lesdiguières collection became public property. So it was fortunately preserved. So it went to form the original nucleus of the municipal library of Tours. Unfortunately, what the devastations of the French Revolution wouldn't do occurred in 1940, for which at least half of the manuscript went lost. But this is what at least we won't be crying for in this video, because what we care about, at least for now, is the content of this library. Lesdiguières, great commander, really a veteran, a man who saw it all, right? The guy that really would incarnate this military province. What did he read? Right? You would think that war is a great part of his interest. So that is reflected in the library? No. So the main section, as we've seen, the core of the collection, shows us this. Classics and very important names. They surely are important for, say, military historical education, but they're sort of much more than that. Tacitus, Pliny, Thucydides, Livy, Polybius, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, and Caesar, right? So surely these are things you read as a commander with a certain eye for the military content. But we have things that do not really resemble treatises. Some significant works connected with warfare are the Grande Annales et Histoire Générale de France by Belforet, the Histoire du Chevalier Bayard by Theodore Godefroy, 1619. This was essentially an equivalent of Lesdiguières from 1 century before. This was basically the French Rainbow of the late 15th, early 16th century, before it was shot in the spine by a falconet ball, right? And a bit embodying the myth of chivalry dying on the battlefield in this very honorable way. He's broken, like he can't move from the waist down, but he wants to be left dying, leaning on a tree by his comrades, facing the advancing Spanish. Or in southern Italy during the Italian Wars. I talked about Bayard in that video about the Italian Wars. This work naturally evokes like the general sense of military mythology, etc. But this is not a treaty on the art of war. We have the Histoire universelle by Agrippa d'Aubigné, 1624, the Inventaire général de l'histoire de la France by Jean de Serres, finally work by Claude Perdon concerning the kings of France. This is mainly a historical interest that, of course, is founded on warfare. Like, at least this is very interesting to look at in perspective. Today, you open a history book in the 21st century, it's structuralistic garbage, right? It's all complex, it's structures, it's a system of society nobody really knows. But at the time, when they studied history, they studied evidential history of politics and warfare, great commanders, big deal things happening. And of course, like, it was social stuff as well, but it was all framed in a traditionally hierarchical sense of the whole, of the system, of a comprehensive understanding, which is also very interesting as far as this absence of treatises of the art of war is concerned, because it shows you how they likely thought of warfare, given that they were men of war themselves and great commanders, and just leaving off of it like. But the thing that they would know much better, this is the actual point, than anyone would actually write on it to try to create that sort of theory that at this time science and philosophy, literature, whatever, had not even properly the tools of creating, or even the reasons for that matter. There are also in this library books related to contemporary events. Interestingly, this is in particular really striking, the Dutch Wars. And of course, this is true because of what we said before. Lesdiguières, as we've seen, had been a Huguenot, had initially fought in France for the Protestant cause, and then he sort of gets realigned with Henry IV's Catholic reign as the same leader of France. This is very French indeed. Understands that France comes before any sort of confessional issue, and of course, mostly Catholic country, especially in Paris, in the most developed, important parts of the country, is overwhelmingly Catholic. So we scoped this political opportunism in the video about the French Wars of Religion. We're not going to come back on it now. But of course, these people were interested in the Dutch Wars. But this is history, right? In fact, the title here is Histoire générale de la guerre de Flandre by Gabriel Chapuis, 1611. Also, we have Histoire générale d'Espagne by Louis Turquet de Mayerne, 1587. You see, it's always, at the end of the day, a historical interest. It's not a technical one. It's not something searching for, what did these generals, broke their minds on deep, theoretical issues of warfare. They studied history. Also, just general history. Like, reflect also on, make a section of Schwerpunkt content, like Créquy-Lesdiguières Library, 1677. This is much more important than you imagine, right? If you search just for warfare, certain particular topics, and you think that the rest of the content has nothing to do with that, or you can do without it, even though you perfectly know that you don't actually know what it's even about, or why, in fact, that's so relevant for the whole. That's the point. You can't understand even the single one, right? And I think this is extremely important. If anything, these men of war would refine their own military understanding more by knowing about the world than knowing. And you see here the important countries of the West, by the way. This is not just France, it is Spain, right? There is this tangential history for the Netherlands because of the confessional issue. And so it's not random. There is a copy of the History of Italy by Francesco Guicciardini that is included. These were true sort of, say, cornerstones of Western literature at the time. So it's obvious that such an important person would have them, right? Remember that here this humanistic Renaissance culture is truly Western European in the flesh and bones, right? In the blood and soul, right? Europeans are heavily aware about one another, especially the elite that really rules the system. Here there are, as you see, Italian queens, regents, say as prime ministers. It's all very important, right, for a French nobleman just to have a broader idea of the wars of Italy in this case. It had just finished and that had substantially been a French failure. Another very important portion of the manuscript texts, especially the ones from this more early modern period, comprises volumes of diplomatic correspondence. This is also extremely interesting. Here, Lesdiguières private secretariat would have carried out this the task of collecting them. Why is diplomatic correspondence useful? Well, obviously, because these people had more than, say, literary historical interest. These people wanted to understand really what had happened politically behind the scenes, and looking at famous, say, rulers, like dealing with one another, knowing what other countries' sort of temper was about in general. And so it's actually a very complete form of education. This is far better than any military treatise that is really abstract and sort of useless when you really know how to make war. A massive chunk of this library, almost 1/3, is represented by theology and ecclesiastical history. 1/3, almost 1/3, which means these guys, again, men of war, wanted to know. Here it's all sort of fractal. Actually, the majority, more than 1/3, is history. All right. Now imagine, I'm very precise with political and financial history. That another third is theology and ecclesiastical history. If you don't understand Christian history, if you don't study history of religion, you're an ignorant. You cannot understand anything. Politics, warfare, society, zero. Right? Doesn't matter what happens now and what happened, I don't know, in the great councils of the church almost 2,000 years ago are so distant. It doesn't matter. Right? If you don't understand why you must know that forcefully, otherwise you're not a Westerner by any remotely traceable degree, you're a failure of a human being. Right? It's by far worse than just not being a Westerner. This is far worse. And it's not like the first thing is something so light you should be happy about. Then, what we have in the remaining third, essentially, science and medicine, and literature and philosophy. This is actually fantastic, right? Because it actually shows that this literary interest is not actually for the sake of itself, right? It's not like literature and philosophy are so prominent overall. They're like 1/10 of the whole. But, right, what comes first, massive, like thrice larger than this, is theology and ecclesiastical history, plus history, politics in general. In science and medicine also come first. These people would have seen like what a ripped apart human being really was after a cannon shot, and so they were interested. Medicine was sort of, growing. Also, as you know, thanks to wars, large, and you have this quite fascinating chunk of it all. By the way, consider that within sciences, here we intend also, next to medicine, geography, astrology. When we talk about literary interest, we talk about poetry, theater as well. A very few about law. There are also some sort of, but it's really minimal, right? The rest of topics. First of all, history, and then theology and ecclesiastical history. This alone, again, this is one of the single most successful French commanders of the time. This is what the guy was interested in. Do you read any manuals or tactics and strategy? Zero. This guy had over 700 manuscripts. Not even one. In this Renaissance, that was in the art of war was inspired by these theories, these treatises that were so complex. This idea of how to apply. Zero. Right? How statistically likely is it for it to be zero? Even if it's just one example, right? I think it's extremely eloquent. There's not even a single title about manuals on tactics and strategy, or any other text regarding them for that matter. This is mind-blowing, right? And reflect also on what von Clausewitz said again about the value of military history. Von Clausewitz says quite clearly that if you don't study military history, you cannot even create a theory. Actually, the theory of the art of war, more properly, is built on the diachronic and comparative study of military history. The guy has plenty of that, right? But he has zero manuals on tactics and strategy. It's completely irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. Not virtually irrelevant. It's literally, absolutely, totally irrelevant. Remember this. So another very interesting aspect of the story is that next to the books, the prints, the manuscripts, there is, as we've seen, this diplomatic and administrative correspondence. As we've seen, Lesdiguières had been working also like as an administrator, as a governor in the Dauphiné, so there was a lot connected with that. He was heavily involved in politics himself, so that was useful. However, we find it is really interesting as a for a medievalist, 13th, 14th, 15th century medieval manuscripts. I mean, actual medieval manuscripts, not copies from later times. Actual medieval, original medieval manuscripts. What do they talk about? Well, we have the Meditations of Saint Augustine. We have the Traité sur la chasse by Gaston Phébus, and Le Saint Graal et Merlin. This is great. Saint Augustine Meditations, a treatise on the hunt, and the Arthurian legends. Le Saint Graal et Merlin is a work by Robert de Boron based on Celtic, British mythology. And then you have even Provençal songbooks from the 13th century. So actual manuscripts of Provençal songbooks of the 13th century, which, if you think about it, it's not even that enormously far away, right? It's 400 years, yes, even less, however. And so it's not like they were so radically different in spirit from the time, especially for, as you understand here, a Huguenot that campaigns in southern France, right? There is that Occitanian vibe that sort of echoes even in the non-documentable, for example, oral tradition, and that you could have experienced in these places. Now, some scholars said, well, but why wouldn't Lesdiguières have a treaty about the art of war, about, say, this tactics, strategy, even just, again, at this time they were quite primitive, that they weren't even something so, developed. This guy was a Huguenot, so he would have had also some sort of Dutch influence as far as that was concerned. He was surely aware that this text existed. And so people gave some sort of, deterministic explanations, mechanicistic ones, like since, the guy had been heavily involved in the Dauphiné during the French Wars of Religion, which was sort of like, as you know, I also made a video about the medieval Dauphiné, but it's this region in the Western Alps that is very, very huge, and at least compared to the forces that Lesdiguières has as his own disposal. He fought a lot there, tough grounds, on great heights, lots of guerrilla. We've seen it with the Valdensians as well. This area would always be a problem for a long time because the Protestants would end up nesting there. And as we've seen, the guy also covers a lot of space during his campaign. As a whole, the Dauphiné is something like 20,000 square kilometers. And the ground especially is very tough. And at this point, at least when he, say, the Saint Lesdiguières converted to Protestantism, and even before from Protestantism to Catholicism, and even before had started supporting Henry IV after his own conversion to the Catholic faith, he had been receiving Spanish support, right? Spanish troops that, as we've seen, were very interested also as far as this sort of Alpine area was concerned, also in Italy, because of the Valtellina and the road to Flanders. So it was a guy that had all the connections with all the most updated sort of military cultures at the time. The Spanish one, the struggle between the Huguenots and the Catholics in France, a Dutch influence, you name it, really. Germany, Italy, etc. So the idea here that saying, well, maybe he was so skilled, also because of the tough terrain, that he didn't really need anyone teaching him tactics, as an explanation for the lack of any treatise on the topic, is of course nonsensical, right? I imagine Lesdiguières, unfortunately we can't sort of ask him anymore, but a guy saying, what the bip is that? You know, for a commander, a gentilhomme, a nobleman, a war is like breathing air, right? You just fight. You're brought up to fight. You are in the military career. You just are used immediately just to command men, from your servants to being commanded and then commanding others and going out on campaign and progressing in the hierarchy, seeing massive bloodshed, violence, destruction, having an idea of how these forces move on the land and how to organize the entire system. You're politically involved. How can any work of the time have anything to do with teaching positively this? We know the works of the time about these are very abstract, sort of anecdotal, celebrative texts. They don't teach you how to make war. That's not how you learn to begin with. Nobody also in the later centuries ever learned war through these texts. I mean, you learned things that eventually you have to apply in order to, when you learn how to make war in the field. But first, like, one thing is largely training, another thing is just actually fighting. These people fought like hell. Like, today's military has sort of different ideas of how things work. In fact, we say just by formation, right? You know, it's not a matter of let's say saying it's better or worse. Like, yes, the military should, I think, know much better what the actual art of war is, which entails studying military history, not in the condensed and sort of superficial way that it's actually done in military academies. If they're taught some modules how to operate in certain conditions, it's fine. Then they will learn along the way, and some do study, some do have libraries. Think about Metis, known as the monk, because most of his sort of literary background, he does cite von Clausewitz apropos, I would say. So it's not like there wouldn't be the guy who has this kind of interests, but it's a completely different world from our own, the one we're witnessing here. And despite this extensive promotion of the Dutch military reforms and their historiographical acclaim in European armies of the 17th century, commanders and veteran soldiers with years of experience, as well as those even just beginning, didn't actually need the stuff. If not like a divertissement of some sort, or something just to learn the basics of how you move, I don't know, like how you actually deploy troops in a formation. They're very technical, like practical things that do not teach you how to fight. They teach you how to form the unit for fighting, which is another thing. It has nothing to do with how you eventually employ that unit for the fight, tactically and strategically. This, as you know, in military theory, are radically different things. It's just like saying, okay, an architect, a military engineer knows how to, from a civilian background, knows how to build a perfect trench. Does he know where to locate it? To have a strategic effect? He knows nothing about that. Right? They're two violently different things. Probably have nothing to do with one another. And as a whole, like, there is a military insight that comes even just from that. There is not a gnostic separation for two things. Like, if you have to do these things, especially at this time where there wasn't really like much of a, at least military academy schools were just being born in a sense, right? So everything was still, you see, you could measure the spread of military theory just on that basis, right? It would always be accessory to the actual command skills. But at this time, everything was incredibly practical, especially in Ladiguerre time. I mean, this guy was born literally during the Italian wars, right? So we are very, very, very early in time. And so it's obviously the practice of fighting, or even just like the nobiliar lifestyle. Just think about being raised in houses where you have great commanders, like other marshals of France as you would become, that would tell you his stories about warfare and would talk about others. You would be raised just in a mindset where you know that all you have to be is like that. That is normality. That's what a person of your status does existentially. There is not an option, all right? Or at least you are like indicated. If you have to pursue an ecclesiastical career, that's it. If you have to pursue a military one, that's it. These are basically them. And then you can try in parallel something else, but let's say it's so normal, you don't even see the option. Because it does not because you're ignorant of it, but because the option is the option sucks, right? You would be a lesser human being. You are a nobleman. You belong to a chosen stock of racially superior people, like that have a metaphysical role in the universe. What the fuck has to do with military treatises? Now, among the French officers who fought in Italy during the 17th century, there were figures like Claude Letouffe, Baron de Siro, which can provide you with an idea of what these men were actually about. Just speaking of military curricula. He started his military life in 1660. He entered as a private in the Garde Françoise. It was a quite praised regiment. Before going himself to the United Provinces to fight, this was yet another Huguenot, alongside Maurice of Nassau, so the same guy that would actually theorize that much, but that was actually at least be within that milieu of the Orange that would propose that same Dutch model that, however, on the field, doesn't matter how successful it was, in fact, wasn't that, right? The Dutch could do just so much within their own context. They did it well because there was a practice of warfare that exceeds any of these sort of propagandistic shout-outs, all right? During the 12 years truce, Siro leaves Holland, where war was over, temporarily at least, and therefore he went over to Turin to serve in the army of the Duke Charles Emmanuel I of Savoy for 3 years, 1622 to 1625. After this, you see, how eclectic the thing is. I mean, he fought alongside the Protestants in the Netherlands, and what does this guy do? Goes over to a Catholic power, to the point of raising a company of light cavalry on behalf of the emperor. Why? Because he goes on to fight on the Hungarian frontier against the Ottomans, which was also like a huge ambition, because these people, as we've seen, had enormous awareness about the Crusades, and that we think this time, even from a French perspective, is definitely very modern and more secularized to an extent. The idea that these people, I don't know, this is not the age of Crusades anymore. This is fully the age of Crusades. There is something so obviously prestigious in going to fight against the Ottomans. And you're a Protestant, serve for the emperor, and by the way, serve with light cavalry, which is definitely not what you would have encountered on the toughest sort of pike and shot kind of battlefields of Flanders or France on a regular basis. But you would find a lot on the Hungarian frontier. We're basically in the steppes, right? So to prove that also that sort of flexibility in terms of how do I learn to make war? These people already knew how to make war. You didn't need treatises. You understand why? It's an incredibly concrete reason. this is not a speculation about how much. Why do you have to focus on treatises so much and not on the, say, cognitive psychology of how these people learned war? That would be an incredibly more important, interesting, and promising field of research than this garbage that the infantry revolution brought about for emotionally unstable people. So look at this band and understand really their core, their substance. De Letouffle, Baron of Sirot, is later attached to the general staff of no less than someone called Albrecht Wallenstein, Duke of Friedland. And again, I'm sort of warming up for a massive video about the 30 Years' War. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but it's going to be tough and partially connected with this story. Letouffle participated to the War of Succession for Mantua, was yet another famous military episode within the broader context of the 30 Years' War in the Empire. And in fact, Claude was present at the siege as well as during the subsequent looting of the northern Italian city. And this restless baron then goes over. You see, he hasn't really abandoned his Protestant youthful connections. He fought for Wallenstein, that, as you know, was raised a Protestant but hated Protestant guts, and basically got killed in part also because the emperor wanted to make peace with the Protestants. He was sort of avoiding that. But our Sirot is a true Europe trotter, let's say. But in this case, there is a greater reason for it. Goes over to the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus, right? And naturally, at this point, even before the Treaty of Westphalia, let's say, there are strange bad partners. Well, for France, it had never really much been a problem. Think about the Impius Ferus with the Ottomans in the 16th century. But as you know, the Swedish army was essentially created by the French money. And Sirot is captured by the imperialists. He manages to secure his release and he comes back to France, where he actually continues with his military career, ending up fighting even against the Spanish in the northeast. This is the same context of d'Enghien, Condé, Rocroi, until the mid-17th century. And these men, you understand, they covered like the entire virtually the entire first half of the 17th century, and they matured this incredible military experience that, I don't know, what would you give to speak with Sirot or Lesdiguières? Say a price, right? We will see how much that means for us. But remember that, you see, I don't want to be cocky or arrogant, but how often have you even heard of these names? How much sort of general culture brings it to the fore? How important is it for the world to know these things? And how impactful it is not to know them, which is actually the terrifying question here, right? It's really not an anecdotal, rhetorical question. It's really a very serious thing, right? And it has to do with the concept of, say, knowing the world through this eternal struggle. It's understanding that basically military history teaches you much more than you essentially thought it was possible, and that there is so much that one should really make the effort of realizing that doesn't stop. You see, I get this unpleasant impression that people watch my videos at large. I have a lot of very strongly dedicated followers that follow me relentlessly and are very attentive. But in general, people choose topics because just strangely the ones they're more familiar with, that may even be normal, right? But once you have acquired a bit of familiarity with the channel, you should know that the next topic is always relevant as far as having a real expertise in the art of war is concerned. There's always something about it. There's always something intertwined with it. We should definitely do more, right? We should definitely cover more. We should definitely be much more, say, responsible, right? The world does pass through this knowledge, right? It's not really an opinion, I would say. I think that the more you distance yourself from this, the least things become easy, right? I would like to connect people through Schwerpunkt as far as this awareness is concerned. And for me, it's amazing. I always say it. For me, this kind of like a general involvement is extremely remunerative from the point of view of really personal growth, right? I can't really imagine how I would just improve my own historical knowledge without this exercise. And very often other paths do not, even properly the ones who are supposed to provide you with expertise, do not actually give you much of this in the first place. So it's pretty tricky. It's pretty unpleasant to a great extent, and I think that of course not everybody has the luck of having the time, the means to dedicate oneself to this, but I would say that if we do this together through Schwerpunkt, I think that step by step, you know, that I take my time to explain things. This is what I'm mostly proud of, right, about Schwerpunkt, that I'm not just giving you the information as if I were trying to buy you with some sort of, I don't know, they're just entertainment, the fireworks, special effects. I'm here to explain. I'm here to disclose. I'm here to just assist, even. I think this is important. I think these topics are important. I think we should definitely be much more involved and make a collective effort, because you know that even from the art of war, that's really what makes the difference. It's how well organized, disciplined, and really willing, right? Even before that, you really are to make a difference. When you understand what this is all about, then you can understand where it goes, and you can see why it is really supportable in the best of intentions. For today, however, I stop it here. We will of course keep talking about these topics sooner or later. However, for today it's over. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.